If you have any interest at all in indie games, then Limbo and Inside are two that you've almost certainly played, or at least heard of. In the 17 years since the founding of the Danish developer Playdead, these two games have been their only output, and yet they've been enough to secure the devs an overwhelming amount of praise and plenty of anticipation for their future projects, not to mention a handful of imitators trying to capitalize on their formula. Not too bad for a couple of indie platformers. But what exactly is that Playdead formula? It's easy to spot the things their games have in common. They're both puzzle platformers that take you on a journey through several cryptic environments, with more of an emphasis on the oppressive atmosphere than any concrete story. I don't think it would be controversial of me to say that these are very simple games. Both have been ported to mobile devices, and given that they use only 2 buttons on a controller, I imagine this wasn't that hard to do. Despite their simplicity though, and despite a number of other significant flaws that I'll get into later, I think most would agree that the weirdness and mystery of these games plays the biggest role in pushing you forward to the end. These are games where it's pretty much impossible to guess what's going to happen next, and they excel at poking the part of your brain that controls curiosity. If you're hoping to find answers to what any of it actually means, you'll almost certainly be disappointed, but at the very least that sense of morbid wonder is enough to carry you to the end of the game. And then possibly to a YouTube video attempting to explain what the hell you just saw. With their focus on providing an experience over any kind of mechanical depth, and their reliance on trial and error to create the illusion of challenge, Playdead's games are part of a lineage that can be traced all the way back to the cinematic platformers of the 90s. Now, with decades of examples to draw from, part of what I want to do with this video is to drill down to the core of that genre to work out its strengths and weaknesses, to get a better idea of where these newer games are innovating and where they're being let down by dated design. Sure enough, almost every game I've played in this genre suffers from a very similar set of problems, however separated in time they may be. Before I get into all that, however, there's an elephant in the room that needs to be addressed. Sometime after the release of Inside, you may have heard that one of the founders of Playdead split off to form a new studio, the appropriately named Jump Ship. What you might not know is that the first game to come out of this offshoot, Somerville, has already been released, and sadly, it's come and gone without making much of a splash. In terms of gameplay, Somerville follows closely in the footsteps of other recent entries in the genre, and is guilty of pretty much all the same issues I have with those other games. And yet, while Inside gets away with its problems and remains a well-loved game, Somerville does not. So since I'm diving deep into cinematic platformers anyway, I figure I might as well take a look at an unsuccessful example before it gets forgotten as a footnote in the history of the genre. Needless to say, going forward there will be spoilers for Limbo, Inside and Somerville, although the only one that's really worth avoiding spoilers for is Inside, which is worth playing blind if you somehow still haven't had it ruined for you. Most game genres can be defined by whatever central mechanic they're built around. In a 3D action game like Elden Ring, that's the combat system, in this case one based on stamina management. In a precision platformer like Celeste, it's in the movement mechanics. Here it's a mid-air dash and the ability to grab walls. In a first-person puzzle game like the Talos Principle, it's usually a mechanic that lets you manipulate the environment in some way, in this case by moving around light reflectors and various other things. But when it comes to the Playdead games, and the genre of cinematic platformer more broadly, there isn't a whole lot I can point to in terms of central mechanics. In Limbo and Inside, all you can do is move left and right, jump and grab, so there's not much in the way of complexity on the player's side of things. You'll use those controls to move through a variety of environments, pushing, pulling and climbing on things, and interacting with the occasional button to keep yourself moving to the right, while avoiding traps and other hazards. Other mechanics that are introduced usually don't stick around long enough to be properly built on, which is fine because it keeps the momentum moving forward, but it's also why I feel comfortable saying that game mechanics are not really a priority for Playdead. Their games are built more on the desire to find out what's around the corner than on any kind of mechanical satisfaction you get from mastering their simple controls, and again I think that holds true for most other examples of the genre too. To be clear, that's not necessarily a bad thing. While it could be said that this hurts the replay value, not every game needs to be designed with replay value in mind, and if the experience of that first playthrough is unique and memorable enough, then it's not a problem for me. I still think Outer Wilds is the most important game of the last 10 years after all. Given that the experience is what Playdead's games are all about, I think it's only right to start there and get into what I believe makes them so beloved in that regard. What struck me when I replayed Limbo and Inside for this video was just how physics-based the movement and puzzles are in both games. In Limbo, you need to manipulate ropes, boxes, and platforms in real time, and while there's certainly still only one solution to each puzzle, the fact that those solutions are reached using real-time physics, rather than, say, a grid-based system, makes your journey feel much more precarious and dynamic. The final section of Limbo is all about influencing gravity, and more than one puzzle relies on your ability to change things in real time for the solution. Though Inside is a bit more grounded when it comes to its physics puzzles, the final stretch of that game is probably one of the most original and impactful uses of dynamic physics that I've ever seen in a game. When you finally get inside the test chamber and become one with this throbbing mass of flesh and limbs, suddenly everything changes, and yet the game's controls remain remarkably intuitive. The real-time animations on this leggy blob are insanely impressive, and there's a palpable sense of weight and momentum to its movement that really elevates the feeling of controlling it. Using a long block of wood to push this button and throwing this flaming cube over the top of these sprinklers is so satisfying to do because it feels like you're creating these solutions yourself out of the raw possibilities of the physics engine. Part of that may just be because of the sudden novelty that comes from playing as this human meatball, but your mind is also sure to be racing at this point with questions trying to figure out exactly what the hell is happening, and it all comes together in a masterful cocktail of shock and awe. I'm trying not to overuse it, but dynamic is the best word I can come up with for the way it feels to engage with the physics in Inside, and while it's clearly felt strongest at the ending here, it's present to a lesser extent in the rest of the game, and in Limbo as well. The platforming is also greatly enhanced by dynamic animations. In both games, your character will reach out for ropes and ledges ahead of time, with different animations depending on your angle of approach. Inside takes this even further, with stuff like the boy looking around in wide-eyed terror while running for safety, or crouching to sneak by some adults undetected, and the clone things catching you to break your fall is just an amazing touch. This attention to detail in animation really brings to mind the cinematic platformers of the 90s, many of which used rotoscoping to get some surprisingly realistic animations out of 16-bit hardware. In most of these games, the jumps that the player character makes are believable ones that any moderately athletic human would be able to perform, and this lends the platforming a sense of weight and realism that, incredibly, can still be effective decades later. In Another World and Flashback, which is the better game in my opinion, a real effort was made to make the environments you move through feel like real, believable places. Bearing in mind this was the early 90s when most of the platformers looked like this, maybe you can see how the more grounded feel of these cinematic games was something of a revelation. I would honestly recommend Flashback even today to anyone interested in the genre, though with the fairly major caveat that using save states is pretty much mandatory unless you like having your time wasted. To my mind, the difference between standard platformers and ones in the cinematic genre is sort of like the difference between a shooter like Doom and an immersive sim like Thief, a comparison I've made before on this channel. While the first category is only concerned with gameplay and will make whatever contrivance necessary to facilitate it, the second is interested in making its world and environments feel like real spaces, with a consistent logic to them. In this scene in Flashback, you're not jumping around on some magic floating platforms in Mushroom Land, you're climbing the light fixtures of a seedy nightclub so you can break into the secret den of corrupt cops hidden underneath it. Playdead's games are firmly in that second, more grounded category, although this is admittedly more true of Inside than Limbo, which Inside blows out of the water in terms of visual and atmospheric experience, thanks to its addition of a third dimension and having more than 2 colours. None of the locations in Inside feel like they're in the game just to pad it out, and there's a consistency to it all that means it appears to make sense, even though you'll probably never truly understand what's going on. Without a word of dialogue being spoken, you move from the woods, to a barren farm, to the outskirts of a city, to the flooded underground beneath it, across a bridge guarded by a shockwave machine, to the labs being protected by it, and the eventual final test chamber with its corpulent surprise. At each stage of this journey, it feels like something new has been revealed to you, and if you just push a little bit further, all the answers might be there waiting for you. In the end, it turns out they're not, and you will undoubtedly watch the credits roll with even more questions than you had 15 minutes earlier. Still, your curiosity about the world of Inside will successfully get you to those credits, and the shock value of those last 15 minutes speaks for itself as an unforgettable exclamation mark to the experience. When viewed purely as an experience then, it's easy to rave about Inside, and despite the criticisms I'm about to make, I think it can easily be recommended to anybody with an interest in that intangible, experiential side of games. But, of course, there's more to playing a game than just that. There's also the mechanics and the gameplay to consider, and it's here that my opinion gets a little less positive about both Limbo and Inside. For what gameplay there is in these games, there are two kinds of scenario you'll find yourself alternating between. Scenes focused on action, where you need to keep moving and react quickly to whatever the situation demands, and scenes that are closer to platforming puzzles, where you have as much time as you need to figure out the way forward. I'll start by getting into the puzzles. Solving the vast majority of puzzles in these games goes something like this. Try the obvious solution, realize that it kills you, then do some variation on it to get past without dying. This dependence on trial and error is going to become a running theme in this video. Take this scene in Limbo where you come across a tripwire underground. Given the ways they've previously been taught to deal with traps, I think most players will quite reasonably try to trigger it on purpose, then retreat back to safety before it hits them, but this doesn't work. And crucially, the only way to discover that this doesn't work is to try it and die. Without any other options, you'll soon realize that, yes, the game really does expect you to go all the way back to the water to drag the corpse over and use it to harmlessly trigger the trap. Here's a similar example from inside. You need to move to the right while avoiding a shockwave pulse that happens every few seconds by hiding behind scenery. By pulling this lever, you stop some rotating machinery so that you can use it as cover from the shockwave while you climb past. When you reach the top, you'll try to run for the next bit of cover, only to find out that you don't actually have enough time to reach it. After failing in this way, it's immediately obvious that you need to leave the machinery running next time so that it can provide cover before the next safe spot. My issue with these puzzles can be summarized like this. You don't have all the information necessary to solve them until you've died once or twice, and this just feels fundamentally unfair to me. The obvious counter-argument to this is that death only sets you back by a few seconds at most, so it's hardly a punishing penalty, but I have some thoughts about that I'll get to after discussing the action scenes, which, by and large, have the same flaws as the puzzles. Once again, my main issue with the action sequences is that they rely on trial and error for the player to learn what they're supposed to do to get through, and this massively lets down the cinematic ambitions that these games are striving for. The scene in Inside, for example, where a dog chases you past this ramp, is just bullshit, and there's no two ways about it. The only possible way of discovering that you don't have time to escape through the window is to try it, get caught and killed, and respawn. What makes this particularly egregious is that at multiple earlier points, including immediately before this, you're supposed to run away from dogs and escape just in time, but here you find out the hard way that the game has switched the rules on you without telling you. The solution is to bait the dog down the ramp so that you can climb up and get a head start on it, but because every interaction you've had with dogs up to this point has taught you to run away from them, you're never going to know this on your first try. And besides, the exit window is off screen, so you don't even know how far you need to run to get to it. I can also point to an example later on when exactly the same thing happens, but you're being chased by a siren instead of a dog. Up to this point, you've always deliberately been given just enough time to escape her, so there's no reason to think that won't be the case here as well. Once again though, you find out the hard way that the rules have been changed, and now you need to bait her away before trying again. Deliberately planning an encounter where the player needs to die in order to figure out what they're supposed to do really rubs me the wrong way, and it comes across as thoughtless design to me. While you may only lose a few seconds of time here, the damage done to your sense of immersion by dying and respawning is immense. On top of that, when you know that dying will sometimes be necessary to figure out how to progress, it ceases to be something you want to avoid at all costs and becomes utterly meaningless. In fairness to Playdead, this is an issue that was present even in the earliest days of the genre, but it would have been nice to be able to say that some progress has been made in the last 30 years. In the very first second of gameplay in Another World, you need to start immediately swimming upwards to get away from these tentacles, or you die. This whole intro sequence of escaping the pool, trampling these worms, running from the beast, then swinging around and running the other way from the beast is an exercise in memorization, essentially one long game of Simon Says, except that you have to work out the pattern for yourself by trial and error, rather than being shown it beforehand, and every time you fail, you die and start again. On a strictly mechanical level, I don't think anyone is likely to find this fun or interesting, but similarly to Inside, if you're able to see past that and instead look at this intro for what it reveals about the world you've been dropped into, that is, if you approach it like you're being immersed into another world, it's still possible to enjoy the experience. I mean, it's surely no accident that that is literally the title of the game, unless you're an American, and this emphasis on interesting environments over gameplay depth remains a hallmark of the genre today. I can't help but think that a brief intro taking place in the normal world before coming here could have helped to sell the alienness of this environment even better, but I'll spare you my suggestions for changes to a 30-year-old game. Once you start looking for this Simon Says design in Playdead's games, you see it everywhere. In Limbo, there's another scene with some underground traps that's impossible to do without dying at least once. Even if you guessed that you need to jump over the raised platform to avoid activating the trap, there's no way to know that the rules are reversed for the second trap, and yet again, the only way to discover that is to die and find out the hard way. It honestly feels like the devs are deliberately trolling the player. Look at this scene in the flooded labs in Inside, where you push a button to open a door and then need to immediately start running left to escape the rolling containers. If you're a little bit too late, you won't have time to make it to safety, although you won't know that until you get crushed. Your fate was sealed the instant you reacted too late, but several more futile seconds will pass before you actually realize that fact when you die. On your next try, which respawns you pretty much right next to the button by the way, you'll know exactly what to do. Simon Says push the button and start running left straight away. Simon Says hide under the rock. Simon Says jump over the fallen tree. Simon Says wait for a second behind this van. Oh, you didn't do it, so you die. This focus on trial and error gameplay is baffling to me because it feels at odds with the cinematic presentation. It seems to me that the whole point of creating a cinematic experience is to let the player get more immersed and invested in the game's world, a goal that Inside frequently accomplishes with its visuals and tone. But all of that work is undermined every time the player has their immersion shattered by dying and being sent back to a checkpoint, which in almost every case only sets them back by a few seconds anyway. I'm conflicted on this issue because the threat of being killed is obviously necessary for there to be any sense of tension, but the illusion of danger created by this trial and error design is paper thin at best, and at worst can even cause frustration by repetition. Little Nightmares has a good innovation in this area. Sometimes a trap won't kill you instantly, but will give you a chance to realize your mistake and undo it. This means that the player isn't slapped in the face with an immersion-breaking death scene every time they try experimenting. I don't think this would work in every situation. Sometimes you do need a good old-fashioned instant kill, but at least when a new concept is being introduced to the player, I think a little more leniency could go a long way towards keeping them immersed without interruption. Heart of Darkness does something similar in its intro, where you can break out of an enemy grapple by swinging them left and right, instead of getting an instant fail. It makes sense that a platformer like Celeste would demand precise inputs from the player and punish them for failing, but in a cinematic game that's seemingly more focused on providing an experience than a challenge, I question the purpose of killing the player over and over again. In fact, I think a big part of the reason Inside's finale leaves such a lasting impression is that it all happens in one take, so to speak, with no deaths or respawns to serve as interruptions, and as a result, it has an unstoppable forward momentum that's incredibly effective and perfectly fits the tone at this point in the experience. Imagine how much less impactful this finale would be if you kept dying and going back to a checkpoint. And yes, I understand that that's one of the things that makes this finale stand out from the rest of the game, but there's got to be a better way of making the player feel vulnerable than by shattering their immersion and repeatedly killing them in completely unfair ways. To illustrate this, we need look no further than Eco, which is the only example I can think of that's translated the cinematic platformer well into 3D, and it deserves a lot of credit for getting so many things right, as well as for being a technical wonder in its own right. Replaying it for this video, I was in awe that this was released only 10 years after this. Pretty amazing, eh? Okay, I'm gonna just gush about Eco for a minute here because it really is that good, but I'll be quick, I promise. Eco takes the focus on realism that we've seen elsewhere in this genre and makes the entire game world into a single traversable space. Frequently while playing, you'll pass through a doorway and realise you're looking down on a room that you visited what felt like ages ago. You'll also see areas in the distance that you recognise from earlier, and this really makes the fortress feel like a believable place with a logical layout. The fact that you can zoom the camera in at any time with one of the shoulder buttons seems almost deliberately included to let you marvel at this. Eco is a game that never kills the player unfairly, and I think you could just about say that it's plausible for a careful player to finish Eco on a first playthrough with no deaths. Unlikely perhaps, but possible. Despite the low number of deaths, the fortress still comes across like a dangerous place, and there are plenty of ways to get yourself killed, it's just that none of them are nasty surprises. The platforming is pretty lenient and gives you a long grace period before letting you fall off a ledge, further reducing the likelihood of you dying and having your immersion broken. Combat is incredibly simplistic and couldn't be called fun by any stretch, but it does succeed at being tense. Knowing that it only takes one of these evil cookie monsters to drag your companion Yorda away, you'll be on edge and protectively guarding her until you know they're all gone. In this way, the combat and the platforming, which mostly revolves around figuring out how to get Yorda to the exit, both contribute to building the player's relationship with Yorda, and you feel a real anxiety whenever she's off screen and by herself. If emphasizing realism above gameplay contrivances is the mark of the cinematic platformer, then Eco is one of the best to ever do it. Eco forgoes all contrivances. There's no HUD or health bar to speak of, and when you pick something up, it's a real thing that you have to carry around, not a MacGuffin that disappears into an inventory to be summoned when needed later. This is equally true of a bomb you pick up for 5 seconds, and a sword that you carry for hours. I don't throw the word masterpiece around very often, but Eco comes about as close to taking that title as any game in this genre could, by maximizing the genre's strengths while minimizing its weaknesses. Okay, gushing over, thanks for humouring me. To return to the point I was actually trying to make, whereas Eco goes out of its way to make it less likely for the player to die and could feasibly be completed with no deaths at all, in Playdead's games there's absolutely no chance of that happening. Trial and error is baked into Limbo and Inside at a fundamental level, and the developers almost seem to indulge in letting you fail into these short death animations. But the ease with which death and its negligible consequences are handed out serve to wear away at the foundations of the player's immersion. Constantly dying and respawning doesn't make me feel like I'm in danger, it makes me feel like death is meaningless, which is surely the opposite of the intended effect, and this is without question Playdead's biggest area for improvement. One final stray thought before I move on. The presence of secrets and collectibles doesn't sit quite right with me in a game that's supposed to have a cinematic feel. When you know that there are optional and missable secrets, you'll develop this nagging itch in the back of your head that asks you to check every corner and possible hiding spot before moving on, which not only robs the game of its forward momentum, but also diminishes its cinematic aspects. Take this scene in the turbine tunnel, where the obvious way out is above me, but just to make sure there's no secret hiding off screen, I can't help myself from swimming over to the right. In order to satisfy the secret hunting itch that the game gave me, and rewarded me for on other occasions, I have to suicidally swim into death, which deals a big blow to the immersion that, again, I think is the whole point of a cinematic style in the first place. I'll concede that this could be a problem with me and not the game, but by showing another comparison to a different series, I can at least hopefully get across why I feel this way. In Eco, there's... just kidding. In the Oddworld games, there are secrets in hidden areas, but they don't bother me here because there actually is more of an emphasis on mechanics and puzzle solving in those games. When a game specifically revolves around finding and figuring out how to rescue NPCs, I think it's reasonable for some of them to be more hidden, and part of your reward for finding these secrets is that you get the challenge of a new puzzle to solve. When the main thing pushing you through a game is its sense of wonder and mystery, however, the presence of hidden areas just slows things down. Whereas Abe's Odyssey rewards you with the good ending for rescuing half of the Mudokons across a single playthrough, Inside's secret ending requires starting what is essentially a New Game Plus, which is yet another thing that undermines the otherwise cinematic feel. I like the idea of a hidden ending in theory, but the way it's implemented in Inside doesn't quite work for me. Right, so that's about it for my thoughts on the games of Playdead, and hopefully I've given a good explanation for why Limbo and Inside were so positively received despite their flaws. I'm going to summarise where I think they fit into the present and, fingers crossed, the future of the cinematic platformer genre at the end of this video, but before I do, I think it's about time I get to talking about Somerville and what makes it a disappointing experience. Whenever I'm critiquing a game that I found disappointing, I usually try to give it a chance to stand on its own merits before contrasting it with more successful examples, but that might be difficult to do here given that I've just spent 20 minutes talking about a very similar set of games. The director of Somerville, Chris Olsen, has actually gone on record to say that the game has been mislabeled as a puzzle platformer, and before release would only commit to calling it a sci-fi adventure. While it definitely has what I would call puzzles, and what I would just about call platforming, I'd like to be able to take Olsen at his word here and judge Somerville accordingly. Unfortunately, since it suffers from an almost identical set of problems as Playdead's games, while also introducing some new issues of its own, I'm going to be making a lot of comparisons, and sadly they rarely come out in Somerville's favour. Starting off with the central mechanics and controls, Somerville has 3D movement rather than having your character stuck on a 2D plane. There's no jump button, but you can climb ledges with the action button, which also allows you to interact with certain parts of the environment. After a brief intro that introduces us to the player character's family and wordlessly kickstarts the plot of an alien invasion, we wake up in the basement and are given the first of 2 puzzle-solving mechanics in the game: the ability to use blue light to melt alien materials and create a path forward. Later on, you'll learn how to use red light to harden the same amorphous substance so that you can walk on it or climb it. Just as we've seen elsewhere, you'll find yourself alternating between sequences of puzzles using these mechanics and scenes that are more focused on action and timing, usually involving avoiding the gaze of alien beings that seem content to stand in one spot for eternity, moving their head left and right. This doesn't make a lot of sense and is obviously not an example of believable design, but to their credit, at least these action sequences don't rely on trial and error, and for the most part it's clearly signposted what to do to avoid dying. That doesn't save these scenes from being incredibly boring, however, and the complete lack of consequences for dying mean that there's no tension or danger to speak of. One thing that really grates throughout a playthrough of Somerville, but especially during certain action scenes, is the fundamental lack of control you feel over your character. At all times, the game dictates the speed you're allowed to move, which isn't a problem when that speed is a run, but is exasperating when it's an interminably slow crawl. Look at this example. You need to move between bits of cover to avoid getting picked up by an alien tractor beam. Is this a situation where you would be walking slowly? Me neither, and lacking the control to make your character move faster when he's perfectly capable of doing so is just frustrating. After playing Somerville, I had a new appreciation for the control schemes of Limbo and Inside, which, despite their simplicity, never left me feeling like my intentions weren't being translated on screen. Alright, so it's not looking good so far, but maybe the puzzles will have more going for them, what with the dedicated matter manipulation mechanics. Well, no, the puzzles are also bland, with only a handful that could be called interesting. In the first half, the goal of each area is to melt the alien matter to clear a path, and the puzzle lies in how to get the light pointed where you need it to be. This can range from switching on a car's headlights to wrapping a string of lights around a tree and moving them upwards. This is one of the more interesting ones. After a short while of this, Somerville very quickly hits the limit of what's possible with its simplistic puzzle mechanics, and before long, starts reusing ideas. The first half also suffers from a bit of inconsistency in its mechanics and puzzle solutions. At the very beginning, you're shown that these alien ball things will follow you and eat the alien material in your way, but the next time you come across them, they won't follow you and need to be coaxed over to the material by using a nearby bucket. This may not be a big deal, and the game is simple enough that you're not likely to get stuck anywhere for more than a minute or two, but the discrepancy in the rules between these two areas doesn't sit well with me and just seems thoughtless. This thing with the bucket isn't a mechanic being taught to the player for them to learn and use later, it's just a one-off roadblock where you need to work out what the game wants from you before you can get past. Once you get your hands on the second manipulation ability in the latter half, most puzzles after that point take on a very similar shape. Either you harden a surface to walk or climb to the exit, or you melt something nearby in order to accumulate enough matter to harden and walk or climb to the exit. Special mention here goes to this puzzle, which is the first one used to introduce you to the new ability and is mildly inventive, but I solved it by accident both times I played the game. The last real puzzle in the mine is about as complicated as the mechanics will allow this game to get, and it's not exactly a head scratcher, being easily solvable by just exhausting your very limited options. Ultimately, it may appear at a glance that there's more potential in the puzzle mechanics of Somerville than the basic controls of the other games mentioned in this video, but those mechanics are far too simple to really amount to anything. I praised Limbo and Inside for their dynamic feeling physics, and while it seems like the mechanics of Somerville are ripe to be used for real-time physics puzzles, there's only one in the game that requires the use of timing, and it's the most fiddly and unwieldy one by a mile. There clearly isn't any computation of fluid dynamics actually taking place in Somerville's engine anyway, and switching matter from solid to liquid is all done via trickery rather than in-engine, as it were. When you melt something, a pool just sort of appears underneath it in a predetermined way. I'm also unhappy to report that the occasional puzzle in Somerville requires the use of trial and error to figure out. Take this scene from the first 20 minutes, when the player is still getting to grips with the game's matter manipulating central mechanic. When you grab this light source and use your melting ability, as you've been taught to do by every other example of the mechanic so far, the overhanging rock falls on your head and kills you. You respawn immediately next to the light and will quickly realize that the solution is to tilt it upwards and remove the overhang first before clearing a path through the rest of the material. This is trivial to achieve and doesn't require any kind of thought on the player's part, it's just that they had no way of knowing they were going to die the first time. Seriously, what is gained by killing the player here? This adds nothing to the experience, it only takes away from it. I could go on about the maddeningly dull and repetitive scene where you have to use trial and error to get across a shop floor without bumping into anything or making noise, but I won't because I think you get the point by now. Okay, so that's it for gameplay, and I haven't had much positive to say, but surely Somerville is saved by its strong atmosphere and tone, just like Inside and Limbo. I'd love to say yes, but if you've been paying attention then you know that I can't. Unlike Playdead's games, where you have no hope of knowing what's going on and will latch onto every esoteric detail to try and find answers, the plot of Somerville is extremely straightforward, and it's not exactly an original one. After a brief introduction, aliens descend from above and one of the human defenders crashes into the player character's house. Reaching out for his hand is what imbues the player with the first puzzle-solving ability, but it knocks them unconscious and leads to the family becoming separated. Travelling across the fields, forests and lakes in the scenes following this intro doesn't offer much in the way of mystery, and you already know everything you need to know to understand what's happening. Again, anyone who's been alive in the last century is already familiar with this trope. Compare this to the first 5 minutes of Inside, which will only leave you with questions, and I think it's clear which one makes for a more compelling intro. The first substantial environment you come across is this field of tents, where my immediate assumption was that this must be some kind of hastily prepared refugee centre for people fleeing the invasion, but after progressing a bit, it became apparent that it was actually the remains of a music festival. So, while I first thought that this environment would have something to contribute to the story of Somerville, it turned out that it was seemingly only here because the devs thought it was a cool location. The mine that makes up the following chapter likewise has nothing to tell the player about the game's setting or story, and is just another run-of-the-mill environment for the usual string of bland puzzles. Upon leaving the mine, you're more than halfway through Somerville, and yet you'll feel like you're still waiting for it to get started. After stumbling towards a row of buildings, the man is reunited with his family in a makeshift shelter underneath a supermarket. Now it's worth pointing out here that the game's Steam page claims that Somerville is a sci-fi adventure grounded in the intimate repercussions of a large-scale conflict, but that simply doesn't hold up to scrutiny when you consider the sheer amount of aimless wandering done in the first half. On top of that, despite the elementary story, Somerville still uses the wordless delivery of Inside, but in a game where the plot is easily understandable, never mind grounded in intimate repercussions, the fact that there's no dialogue means that the people involved in this story are characterless and forgettable. When the man eventually reunited with his family, it took me a second to realise who they were. Immediately after this, the family leave the safety of the shelter for some unfathomable reason, and are soon separated yet again when the man is taken by the military to some installation in the middle of the ocean, where he's forced to go through tests to showcase his mastery over the manipulation of matter. Even if we let go the laughably insulting first test that just asks the player to walk between a series of points, every trial you're put through here involves the simplest kind of puzzles that you already demonstrated understanding of long ago. Now clearly this sequence has more of a narrative purpose than a mechanical one, but I don't think that means it should be completely let off the hook in terms of providing interesting gameplay, because unless the intended effect here is to make the player feel bored, then I think it's safe to say this scene doesn't succeed at what it's trying to do. After being catapulted into the alien mothership, the man goes through a series of hallucinations and flashbacks that test his resolve, which is a great excuse to reuse earlier parts of the game, by the way, and eventually ends up holding hands in a giant circle of people playing Simon Says with some alien monoliths. And it literally is Simon Says this time. Depending on the patterns you communicate here, there are a few different endings regarding the fate of the man and his family, but you're very unlikely to realise that on a first playthrough, or even that you're seconds away from finishing the game in the first place. You'll probably stumble into the first bad ending that presents itself, then won't understand what happened, and will just assume that the ending sucks. Which means that it does suck. When I walked into the house and saw the credits roll, I had no idea what just happened, but what's worse is that I didn't particularly care. Throughout my time with Somerville, the game did nothing to pique my interest or make me feel invested in seeing what happened next. Despite its dedicated puzzle mechanics, it's also lacking in interesting problems to solve, and again what little there is doesn't tell you anything about the setting. Whereas Inside and Limbo will consistently surprise you with stuff you weren't expecting, Somerville only offers mundane environments, faceless characters, and a plot totally devoid of substance. Though Limbo has absolutely nothing in the way of plot, it still succeeds in making the player inquisitive about its world, and it has an unmistakable atmosphere. I may have had no idea what just happened when the credits rolled on inside, but the preceding 3 hours had me intrigued and invested enough to want to figure it out. Although the gameplay of Somerville shares a lot of the same shortcomings as Playdead's games, it bored me in a way that those other games didn't because the experience as a whole wasn't strong enough to excuse it. This intangible, experiential side of games is a murky area of critique that starts to get very subjective, as what makes a memorable and moving experience for one person might mean nothing to somebody else. If Somerville clicked with you, then you may be tapping out a comment right now telling me how wrong I am and why I should kill myself. At the end of the day though, all I can safely say is that it didn't click with me, and I'm clearly not alone. The games I've covered in this video exist in a curious category that's focused on providing an atmospheric experience over gameplay depth, and yet they're still enhanced by their interactivity as they let the player's curiosity lead them onwards. As the inheritors to the genre of cinematic platformer, Playdead has taken big strides in improving on the best parts of those older games, particularly with their environmental design and the believable and dynamic animations. The consistency of the simple button schemes in their games contributes greatly to the feeling of control that the player has over the action on screen, and this is another area where Somerville took a step backwards. But I'd be lying if I said that Playdead's games haven't inherited some flaws from their predecessors too. I played a good handful of cinematic platformers for this video, and I couldn't help but notice that no matter what decade they're from, every one of them suffers from the same problem: tedium. With the trial and error puzzle solving inherent to these games, the placement of checkpoints is the deciding factor in whether or not you'll have the patience to sit through them. I don't think I would have made it through playing Flashback on the SNES if I hadn't been using save states to smooth over the time-wasting repetition. When they're able to keep up their forward momentum, these games can fascinate you with a steady stream of new environments and situations, but when that stream is interrupted, say by lingering to look for secrets or by repeatedly dying and redoing a single section, the momentum comes to a screeching halt and the skeletal nature of the gameplay is laid bare for all to see. While that remains an issue in Playdead's games, it's far less noticeable because of the more frequent checkpoints, which certainly makes it more bearable to play but doesn't really address the core problem at the heart of the genre: that dying is not cinematic. Playdead is onto a really good thing here, and it seems like they've figured out what makes the cinematic platformer compelling. If they can capitalize on that and trial and error their way out of the last weaknesses in their design philosophy, they might just have a chance at the top spot next to Eco.